Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine last February, the sanctions have targeted the financial sector in Russia, the military, industrial, and defense sectors, the weapons manufacturing, oligarchs, their assets, as well as political, financial, and corporate leaders. It's an amazing list. Dozens of high-tech companies, Russia's biggest shipyard, you name it. But the question that we want to ask tonight is, to what effect? They didn't stop Vladimir Putin from, and the warnings that were issued in advance didn't stop him from invading. And the sanctions imposed after he invaded haven't stopped him from annexing 4 Ukrainian provinces and from calling up reservists. They haven't stopped the massive barrage against Ukrainian cities and in the last few days against the electrical power grid either. Do sanctions work? Do they ever work? I only have to mention some of the countries that have long been under sanctions, like Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, and Afghanistan before 9/11. Do we impose these sanctions because they're there, and we can, and successive administrations do that, as a substitute for a more muscular policy, as a symbol, as a political statement? Well, our speaker tonight, Jim O'Brien, has the answers, or he will come as close as anybody can, I think, to answering them. He is the newly installed, and he's being called as the czar of sanctions. And it's a new position. Well, this is actually an intentional czar, I think. But it's a new position at the State Department. I've known Jim going back to the Balkan Wars. He is an example of the exceptional political appointee who has served in successive democratic administrations with such capability, devotion, and imagination, I should say, that they keep on inviting him back. He was a senior advisor to the late and great Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. He helped formulate the 1995 Dayton Agreement, Peace Agreement, focusing on the Bosnian Constitution. He guided U.S. support for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He worked on agreements to control weapons of mass destruction in the former Soviet Union, so he's on target on that one. And he also negotiated agreements protecting intellectual property rights for scientific operations, for scientific work with China. Later, he became the vice chair of the Albright Stonebridge consulting firm in Washington that Madeleine Albright headed. And during the Obama administration, he was the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs from 2015 to 2017. Czar O'Brien, the floor is yours.
So I'm here because Roy asked me to be here. And I think you've got a great president, but it's really important to me to be able to say this about Roy, because he's really affected my career in a couple of ways without knowing it. But it's also a sign of how all of our careers end up having much longer tails than we anticipate, when we're setting off on them. So I was a young lawyer at the State Department. And actually, Roy, I started as a civil servant. I grew up in Nebraska. All I really wanted to do was work on big problems in an institution where I thought being right might actually matter. So when I left law school, like a lot of my friends, they made money. And now I kind of regret I didn't realize how much money they were going to make. But I sort of wanted to go to a place where every so often you'd have the ability to say, I don't think this is the way we ought to do it. And somebody, they might say, shut up, but they would say, we'll talk about that later. Whereas my friends who were just working in private equity or lawyers for private equity or, on down the list, the answer was like, that's not a question we discuss. And so I really just wanted to work in government on big problems. So I started in the George H.W. administration as a lawyer at the State Department. My second week on the job, the Berlin Wall fell. And I thought, geez, that's the last interesting thing that's going to happen. And I don't even know where the bathrooms are yet. So I began working in that environment. And what happened a few years later was that Yugoslavia imploded. That wasn't on the agenda of the Bush administration. They kind of wanted all these multinational states to stay together so that they could focus on what they felt were big strategic questions. And so the result was America wasn't there at a time when this was a small fire, and it became a big fire. So I had originally been working on some other issues, and then of course at the State Department, when you get good at something, they move you to a new desk, right? I mean, I'm sure many people here have done that. And so I was working, answering questions about what constituted war crimes. It was kind of a sleepy portfolio. One of my main clients was a guy named John Bolton, who didn't believe that there were war crimes, and so or there was an international law to enforce it. So it wasn't really a happening mandate until a group of reporters came out with the story that there were concentration camps in Bosnia. And it was like Ed Villamy and you and others, right? And I was outraged. And I thought, well, I came to this place a couple of years ago thinking I should be in a position to find a way to raise up something that I thought was an atrocity, and that we should have a U.S. response at a time when we were, frankly, not that interested in having a response. So what could I do? And as a young bureaucrat, the first thing you learn is where you stand matters a lot. So I was a lawyer. I wasn't able to say that we should have a armed response to the collapse of Yugoslavia. But what I could say is there's not just a legal problem here, but there are answers in the law. And with some other lawyers, we began working on a set of steps to document, investigate, and ultimately prosecute the war crimes that were being committed in the former Yugoslavia. And all that happened because of a set of stories that Roy and other reporters brought forward. So it's a sign, like when you're on the outside, often I think, and I've spent half my career inside and half my career outside. When you're on the outside, you feel like you're throwing pebbles at a window. You don't know whether it's having an effect. But that was a direct effect. And here's another story where, Roy, you made a big difference. So a few years later, the U.S. was dipping our toes in becoming more involved in peace talks and forcing a peace to the Balkan War. Very reluctant. You know, this was just we were still under the shadow of Mogadishu and the failures of forcible peacemaking. And so there was a real desire not to put U.S. troops in the way and thus not to have a muscular U.S. foreign policy. And that got solved by events on the ground. Because in one of the enclaves, right, an area cut off from any support, a large group of Muslims, Bosniaks, were living. And the Serbs came in and took people out. It wasn't the first time. There'd always been a bit of fighting around some of these enclaves. But this time they evacuated them. They separated the men from the women and children. And nobody could find the men. And it's odd. When I talk to my kids, it's sort of hard. They're like, why don't you look on Google Earth where these people are? And what happened over the next few days was that gradually sort of rumors came that the men were being spread across Bosnia, put into sites, and murdered. And we only began to get some documentation like about a week and a half, 2 weeks afterward, when a few stragglers managed to walk their way through forests and hills and come out and say, they killed a bunch of us. I managed to survive. Here's where I was. Go look for the site. And so we decided to try to document this and to try to jolt the world into authorizing a more aggressive response. And part of what happened was then Ambassador Albright said, I want to go to the Security Council at the UN, and I want to present the best intelligence we have of what has happened to these men, and I want it to be airtight. And I was the one who had to write the proposal. Now, with her eye on history, she had somebody look back. It's the first time the U.S. had brought intelligence into the Security Council since Adlai Stevenson during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this was a big moment. Set the predicate for Colin Powell's presentation, which was not as good. But when I was preparing this, what we found was we had people out in the field interviewing the survivors, interviewing anybody who might know something about where the men had been taken and what had happened to them. And then we had, because of one intrepid guy, we had an analyst who went and developed all the film that we were taking. You know, I love these movies where people can just call up on screens and sort of, you know, find inch by inch photographs of an area. At the time, what we had were these air flights that took like photos that came out in literal like oil can sized drums of film. And someone had to develop those manually and look through them. And what he found were a series of flights went over a small area of Bosnia. And on one day, you could see trucks and what looked like people milling about on the field. And on the next day, what you saw looked like maybe bales of hay lying in a field. And then after that, you saw bulldozers and fresh earth dug. But in order to tell the story, I wanted to be able to say, we have a photo of this place before and after. And we have a person who was there, someone who survived. And we found an interview with someone who said he was there, but wasn't there at the time that the shots were fired. And so the morning that then Ambassador Albright was going into the Security Council, I was in Washington, she was in New York, and I said, I don't think we can use these photos because we can't provide the context for it. And here's an example of how the mid-1990s is 150 years ago. She said, how can you say that? There's an article in Newsday today by Roy Gutman that interviews somebody who was there. Why aren't you using that? And I said, well, it's Washington. We don't get Newsday clips down here in the morning. So they faxed me the article, and it said in the article, and I was still like, can we use just a journalist report? The Russians aren't going to buy that. And it said, you wrote in the article, you said this person had been interviewed by a specific State Department official. So I went to that guy's office. He was on vacation. And I dug through his desk and I found the notes from that interview. And so I was able to take the little lead that Roy gave, and all of a sudden we had these notes that hadn't been typed up that said this man was there, loaded on a truck, pushed off the truck, made to line up with his friends and family in front of a pit. And what he did was fall a little bit early. So the bullet grazed him, and then he dug his way under the bodies and waited until the Serb forces were both so drunk and tired that they started to leave, at which point he walked for a week or more out to tell his story. That presentation, which maybe lives on YouTube somewhere, was so definitive that the Russian ambassador said nothing. It was at that moment they said, okay, tell us what you want to do, and we will sign up to it. And that happened because of Roy's reporting. So I think it's, yeah, no, it's wonderful. And that also now, it lives on to today, because now I'm in this office as the sanctions coordinator. Kind of weird. I always thought you should be an ambassador to a place, but not like for coordination. But in this office, what I realized from that experience and others like it is that the US government, with all the might of our intelligence and photography and everything else we have, we're not often the way to get this cleanest story and to know who actually is causing the problems abroad. You have to be actively engaged with journalists, with civil society, with people on the ground in order to have somebody tell you what's happening. And then we can start to use our resources to put together the case. So when you ask how Mademoiselle Dugina comes to our attention, it's because we're talking constantly to people outside government who say, these are the people who are causing the problems that you care about. And that was a lesson taught to me directly right then, because I had the full might of the US government in 1995 saying, let's tell this story. Here are photos, here are transcripts, here are intercepts. And what mattered was what a journalist found. So that back and forth now, I've designed my office, I've hired people out of some of the journalistic coalitions who turn up scandals around the world, because I want to have that interplay feeding into US policy as we design our sanctions around the world. So that's, anyway, just a story on how it all matters, right? We're all just sort of throwing pebbles into a lake, and the ripples carry on a lot more than just our initial step. So I'll say a brief word about the office that I run, and then I want to talk about the sanctions for Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine for a minute. So the office that I run for sanctions coordination is at the State Department. It was created by legislation, backed largely by the Republican minority in the Senate. And the reason for this was that there had been an effort to have a sanctions coordinator, a guy named Dan Fried, a multiple-time U.S. ambassador, a great diplomat. You should have him up here sometime. And Dan finished his time, and Secretary Tillerson said, I don't need a sanctions coordinator. I'll take care of it myself. And so the office was literally locked and not used for many years. And the Congress felt this was a huge mistake because too often sanctions seem to be an externality to policy. That there's something that happens to diplomats. Suddenly their interlocutor is threatened with sanctions, or there's a replacement for policy. We don't know what to do, so let's just designate this person and say they can't come to the U.S. And what they really need to be is one tool in a basket of tools that we use to try to affect behavior. So Congress enacted this legislation, and at the same time, this was passed over President Trump's veto and finally enacted in the last week, the last days of the Trump administration. And at the same time, Secretary Blinken and the team around him asked me if I would consider playing a role like this. And in fact, I think after he asked me to do it, we have worked together off and on for a few decades. And he turned to someone and said, but he'll really do this? Because it seems like a thankless job. But what I find fascinating about it is that sanctions now are a core tool that we use around the globe. And they really need to be an instrument that opens doors for other policies. So if we want access to critical minerals around the world, very often those are already subject to some kind of a contract with some foreign power. Those contracts often are based on corruption or rest on odious environmental or labor practices. Those are the kinds of activities that we can sanction. But it only makes sense to do that if we're going to follow it up with an affirmative offer that provides those countries with a different way of developing their resources, for example, or with a different way of managing their public procurement processes, or whatever the corruption or state capture lies. So the opportunity to be part of bringing all these tools together, for me, was fascinating. Now, the lie they told to me was, Jim, come and do this, come in at the start of the administration, and we'll work together and you'll kind of get this organized before there's a crisis. The way that our confirmation process works, I finally arrived in April of 22. And at that point, everybody from the president on down was a desk officer with ideas about who should be designated when in response to Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine. And so it's really been an exercise in learning all of the ways that the U.S. government's able to respond to something as egregious as this horrible war. So I want to talk in a little bit about some of the questions you raised, kind of focused on Russia, Ukraine. Similar topics come up as we look at situation in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, particularly Central America, and places around Asia. And I'll just say as a definitional matter, when I talk about sanctions, I'm really talking about all the tools of economic coercion that are available to us and to our partners. So economic sanctions say, like, you can't travel to a place, or you're not allowed to have a bank account in dollars. You can't have a transaction that touches our banking system. Those are the classic old sanctions. There are trade restrictions. You're not allowed to trade a certain thing. You trade it, but it's at a higher tariff rate, or other ways we adjust the flow of goods and services across borders. And they're just pure export controls. You're not allowed to sell this item to those people. Or if you want to sell it to them, you have to come and ask us for special permission, and we might put some restrictions on it. So it's export controls, trade restrictions and benefits, and pure financial sanctions. So what are we trying to do with these things? And I'll try to break this down a couple different ways, and then we can get into questions. So the first thing is we've got three goals when we're looking at the economic side of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. So one thing is we want to reduce the resources available for the war. In fact, I should say the wars. And this is really important when we think about the effectiveness of sanctions. This is Putin's imperial project. It's not a one-off to take some territory in Ukraine. He announced in 2007 his intent to recreate what he saw as a kind of Russian space. And now he described it in different ways. Parts of the old Soviet Union, the Muscovy Empire, the traditional homeland, right? It kind of changes because, frankly, it's an illegitimate historical fantasy. But for him, this is one among many conflicts that he had begun by invading Georgia in 2008 and intended to continue. And the original concept was he would go into Ukraine, take what he wanted quickly, and then begin to threaten other places, Moldova, more of Georgia, possibly even the Baltic states, and try to create the sphere of influence he felt had been guaranteed to Moscow at the end of World War II. That dream's dead. Nobody can look at the performance of Russian troops or the support for the Russian venture and say, yes, it's very possible that they will extend this effort beyond where they are now. So we're going to talk about how sanctions are affecting the war on the battlefield in Ukraine. But let's not forget, for him, this was this was just one among many episodes. And those episodes, I think, are receding rapidly as he looks at the battlefield today. So that's one. Reducing the resources available to him. And I'll talk about how we measure that in a minute. Two, we want to reduce our own reliance on Russia. And this is really important. So the leverage that's been an issue for us has been that many of our partners depend in whole or in part on Russia for oil, gas, food, fertilizer. And we're seeing a remarkable change. So Germany is 2/3 less dependent on Russian gas than it was just a year and a half ago. And it's on its way to zero. Italy's at zero. France, for all its problems, zero. So all across Europe, traditional markets are being shut off to Russia. Even more vulnerable states like Bulgaria, I was just there a few weeks ago, and they have plans now to be 2/3 less reliant on Gazprom for their energy. And now this raises a real problem, and this is the test, the next few months, and then maybe the beginning of next winter, because the transition to alternative sources of fuel, whether they're fossil fuels or renewables, is probably going to take a year and a half. So we have to get through one, maybe 1.5 winters. But at that point, even Russia's own internal estimates, I believe, are that their oil and gas markets start to dry up, and they're going to have to shift to sell to lower cost markets, and they'll be beholden to a few very large purchasers who will drive a tough bargain on prices. Now, why do I say this is a goal of our sanctions? It's a little like, if you remember the old myth, it's like Ulysses lashing himself to the mast. So what our European partners did was say, we are not going to import, we will not allow any financial transactions for the import of Russian oil and gas into our territory. So they've made it illegal for them to do the thing that has been their habit really since the early 1980s. And that's repeated across the sanctions realm. So we're reducing our dependence on Russia, and that increases our leverage when we come to thinking about what the world will look like after this conflict. The third goal is, frankly, to keep global markets functioning smoothly. Russia's a very important provider of oil. It's a tight oil market, as we all know, every time we fill up our gas tanks. And so we want to keep Russian oil on the market. Russia is an incredibly important provider of food and fertilizer, particularly to the global south. This is a really recent development. I mean, when I was last looking at the numbers in, say, 2015, Russia was an important but not irreplaceable provider. But now I think there's something like 19 of the world's poorest countries. I'm going to get that number wrong, so don't quote me on that. Import more than half their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. And that's a relatively recent phenomenon. So we need to keep that flowing. So we don't have any sanctions on Russian food and fertilizer, and I'm happy to talk about some of what we're doing to make sure it gets to market. So we're trying to keep these global markets going while at the same time reducing the resources available to Putin, frankly, and to Russia to use its on the battlefield. I don't think that's something that's ever been tried, right? We look back at old sanctions programs. They were full blockades, efforts to deny all funds and resources. This one is a more difficult balance. But I make incredibly ugly furniture as a hobby. Like it can stay in the den or in the basement, but my wife won't let my furniture anywhere else in the house. But the one thing I know is that a 3-legged chair is the most stable. So that's what we've got, but it means we're not doing any one of those things at full tilt. So when you look and say, why aren't you cutting off all sources of money? It's because we want to see these goods continue to go to market. Why are we allowing the goods to market? Because that makes it sustainable for us to continue supporting Ukraine and keep the global South on side. And that works. Last week at the United Nations, 143 countries voted to condemn Russia's purported annexation of territories in Ukraine. That's a big number in itself. What's even more remarkable is that it's more countries voting against Russia than voted against Russia in February when they first invaded. It's 43 more countries than voted against Russia's annexation of Crimea 8 years ago. So what you're seeing is a sustained global campaign to isolate Russia and to highlight the criminality in what it's doing. Now, exactly how are we doing this with sanctions? And I'll try to cut through this and get to how we talk about their effectiveness. So I think of our sanctions as operating with 3 buckets. And I didn't bring numbers with me, but there are hundreds and thousands of individuals and institutions that have been designated. But we're really doing 3 things. One of them is we're highlighting the illegality, the criminality intrinsic in this imperial operation. So when Putin says we're going in to denazify or we're going in to liberate Ukrainians, that, to use a very diplomatic term, is bullshit. And they all know it. A very senior former Kremlin official, and he's former because he has some independent views, told a good friend of mine a couple of years ago, he said, when we invaded eastern Ukraine, when we invaded Crimea, we knew most of those people were Russians. And in fact, many of them were Russian citizens who'd retired and always had Russian passports. Doesn't mean Crimea is Russian, but it just means a lot of the people there who were. So said we went into Crimea, we knew a lot of the people were Russian. When we went into eastern Ukraine, we knew the people spoke Russian. We thought that meant they were Russian. And we got there and we found out they're Ukrainian. And it wasn't like a category that we knew about. So for Putin, he doesn't really see this as an independent place. And so he wants to impose on them his vision of a Moscow-centered, a Russophile state. That's a violent, criminal, imperial enterprise. And so a lot of our designations are meant to highlight that. So the institutions that are involved in atrocities, so we're digging up mass graves in most of the occupied territories. The torture pits are found. Every time we can find the people involved, we single them out because we want to make it impossible for them to travel around the world and to enjoy any of the benefits that they might have from participating in this. So, they can hide, but they can't run. And even if some of them are just low-ranking soldiers who might never be part of the world, it matters that they're being told, you are part of a criminal enterprise. And the world looks at that. The people who run what are called the filtration systems, right? Everyone in an occupied territory is made to go report, be interviewed. Some of them are shipped off to camps. They're all registered. Their social media is tracked. Their phones are tracked. All of this is an effort to impose a very oppressive system in an occupied territory. It's a crime. So we want to call attention to that. So all of the local officials who have agreed to be part of that, they end up on our sanctions list and many of the EU and UK sanctions lists. The same thing, you walk through every part of this, thefts of grain, on down the list. So we want to highlight that piece so it can't be forgotten. And I'm a big fan, and this goes back to the work that Roy did, both reporting in the Balkans and later on the War Crimes Handbook. I think when you make it impossible, you make people see what's really happening, then they can't look away as easily. And that makes it easier to build support. So that's one thing the sanctions are doing. Second thing, we're denying Russia the tools it needs on the battlefield. And this is really around export controls. So we've put in several hundred types of restrictions on military use or dual use items. The EU has matched us, and I think that stunned Putin. He never expected that we would have a coalition. So we have 38 states that are the source of virtually all the high-tech items that Russia needs in its military have come together to say, we will not sell to you. Russia's unable to produce many of the weapons it needs as a result. So when you think about Russia making a lot of money from its oil and gas, ask yourself, what can they spend it on? Because they can't buy the things that they need to go out on the field. And I'll talk about the effects more in a minute. The third thing that we're trying to do is to protect our own societies. So we have a whole series of designations that go to, say, Russian financial institutions. Now, these are often part of a giant lake of Russian money that has been put to use in our societies, often with terrible results for the communities, but also it just becomes a pool that's used for individual enrichment and occasionally public purposes, like financing the poisoning in Salisbury, England, or other things. We want to try to move that out of our societies. So the Russian financial institutions, when they're taken off the international electronic payment system, they can be very important. They're large, but they're no longer a bank that ordinary people use or that can participate in ordinary transactions around the globe. Oligarchs and their glamorous children, right? Putin wants to project that this is a hard man's regime. This is a point Andrew makes wonderfully in his book, and I hope he talks about it, right? So they're the soft power to this hard man's regime. And now they're not going to be a part of things because many of them are designated. And so they're not any longer a part of the global society. Fair, unfair? What it is, it's important to say we're defining what it means to live in a rule-abiding society. And if you're going to benefit from Putin's system, which I'm happy to talk about, but you'll have Andrew, who's one of the great experts on this. If you want to benefit from Putin's system, you can't spend that money in a way that affects our politics, that changes our information systems, and that begins to, it allows you to commit crimes at home and then live, in luxurious places around the globe. So those are things we're trying to do. Now, does this work? And as Roy said, it doesn't stop Russia yet from hurling dumb bombs and ill-trained conscripts and many of the tools of death that it has on the battlefield in Ukraine. What it does, it makes them much less effective, and it's a ticking clock on how long they can sustain what they're doing. So I want to mention 3 items, and then I'll throw it open to questions. One of them, we do see the sanctions show up on the battlefield. You're seeing Russia withdraw from areas, and in part that's because it doesn't have the equipment to defend. You see 2 tank factories have shut down production. These are factories that produce very high-end equipment, but before the war, they were asked to produce about 100 tanks a year each. And they didn't make that quota. Now they're being asked to produce 1,000. But they can't buy the equipment they need. So you start to look across for navigation equipment, for chips, semiconductors, anything that's needed for warfare after 1995. They have a lot of trouble sourcing it. Now we see a great improvisation by the Russians. They buy a lot of cheap cell phones and then repurpose those. But it means, in a way, we're chasing them back in time. So they're not fighting a war of 2022. They're using 2012 equipment or 2005 equipment to put it in and use and try to fight that way. So we're adding designations to deny them this older equipment. We're denying them ways to circumvent our sanctions. But the result is the equipment, when they use it, is a lot less effective. And we can start to see how much that matters, because what we see on the battlefield is much less of the integrated, fast-moving fighting that you see Ukraine use. They don't have the reconnaissance drones, or they have very few of the cruise missiles that you'd want to use almost as battlefield artillery. So they're having to ration those. And then they misuse them by firing them at civilian targets. So they're not available for use on the battlefield. And so all that shows up. And in an odd way, you can start to see the contrast where Russia does get some cutting edge weaponry. They're suddenly much more effective. So they've gotten these Iranian drones. They're using those in Odessa and a few other places. And they start to have some real impact. Why don't they have impact elsewhere? Because they don't have much of it. So the export controls are really biting them on the battlefield. And that's going to be a continuous part of this conflict going forward. The second thing is they have fewer resources to spend. Now, this feels bizarre because they're earning something like $80 billion a month from oil sales. That seems like it should be enough. But in fact, for an economy Russia's size, it's not. Just a few numbers. And here I'm going to say a lot of the traditional macroeconomic indicators people throw around, they're kind of useless. Okay, Russian GDP is going to be smaller. They're going to have a recession this year. Maybe it's 4%, maybe it's 6%. All of these numbers are a little fictional. It's hard to see the difference between 100%, 96%, 6%. But when you talk about is the ruble strong or weak, well, it's very strong, but that's because they can't spend it overseas. So it's, so all these figures become kind of a game. What I look at is what's their burn rate? And you look at this, and it's pretty phenomenal. They started this war with about $640 billion, or euros, kind of the same thing now, but $640 billion in reserves, as well as what they're earning every month. In an ingenious move that predated my arrival, so I can take any credit, the Western coalition froze all the Russian sovereign money that was outside Russia. Now, why was it outside Russia? Well, because it wasn't very safe inside Russia. So they put half of it out in a variety of other places. All of that is frozen. So now, instead of sitting on $640 billion, like Scrooge McDuck, they're now sitting on $340. And you walk through, and then you say, well, okay, that's still a lot. They can afford to pay their population and conduct this war, except they can't get their population much of what it wants. So they're spending more money to give people lower quality goods or fewer items, or to subsidize businesses that are really not profitable. So they're doing that, and they're doing it at a rate that's really burning down their resources. So they spent, we think, about 25% of that $340 billion last year. They've already announced budget cuts for this next year of at least 10%. My guess is it'll end up being more. And so what they're looking at is, even as some cash is piling up, they're unable to spend that or to move it around the economy in a way that's sustainable. So my guess is you'll start to see some serious dislocations in Russia. Some people say it'll be in 3 to 6 months. Some people think it's longer. I personally think it'll be longer. I think, one observer who's been traveling through small towns in Russia said earlier this week that the population says, well, this is just like the Soviet Union. There's enough to live on, but not very much else. And so I think they'll be able to sustain this for a bit, but they're in a situation where every day is worse than the day before. It's a little less ability to buy something, a little bit less money available to do all the things they want to do. And they're fighting a foe is incredibly determined. And this is where I'll close. I'm late here tonight because I was with a visiting Ukrainian delegation and the secretary and others. And the courage and creativity of the Ukrainian people in fighting this war is phenomenal. And every time I meet people, whether they're soldiers from the front line or the ministers and government officials who are making sure that the railroads are open so that the equipment can get where it has to go. I'm just amazed at what they are doing. And I'm proud that we're the largest donor of military and civilian equipment to them, because it's their fight, but it's our fight. And so talking to them, what they see is that they're getting better and better. And the other side is going, again, back in time. So they're now at a point where they're going to mobilize hundreds of thousands of ill-trained, out-of-shape, often old conscripts, and they're going to have to throw them on the battlefield and just hope that they can overrun Ukrainian positions. And in this situation, the more we do now to help the Ukrainians withstand this onslaught, then the much less will be available for Russia going forward. And that's a combination of the military side of the equation and the sanctions and export controls and other restrictions that we're putting on, so that Russia has less to throw at the Ukrainians. So that's how we're sort of working our way through that. I don't know, Roy, should we just open it up to questions?
Yes.
Check.
That was a very illuminating presentation, I think we all learned a lot, and I learned a lot even about my own stories. It's amazing that it happened tonight, so thank you for that. Why don't we go directly to questions from the audience, and I'll bring this around.
How do you see this ending? Thomas Friedman had a column in the New York Times saying he can't foresee a good ending to this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first, the path to an ending is going to be horrific, right? What we're seeing right now is that Russia's choice is to escalate against civilians. That's not going to stop until they're unable to do it. Or maybe they just listen to how horrified their friends and partners are. Or finally soldiers break. When's that going to happen? We don't know. And so this is, I think, a point I try to make about sanctions. So I gave you some numbers, and I could just recite numbers all night. But really the way sanctions work is like the way soldiers' morale works. What we're doing is now Russian officials and Russian business executives have to buy goods from unfamiliar vendors, right? They have to buy something that they think they can tweak and make it fit. They don't know when it's going to show up, but they're having to work through routes they don't understand. That amount of friction and uncertainty in a system can continue for a long time until it finally just stops. People get just exhausted, or they buy the wrong things once too often, and the system just can't keep going in the way that it had before. And that's exactly like soldiers' morale. It's impossible to define when you reach that point, or to predict when you reach that point. You can't quantify it, but it's real. And so most wars end because one side, the soldiers say, I don't want to die for this. So I'm going to surrender, desert, lose. And that's the only way I can see right now. And I got to tell you, the Ukrainians have nowhere to go and no intention of backing down. So in that equation, I think they have the edge. So then how does it end? What's remarkable to me, if you look this last week, the leaders of the G7, so a group that's always cautious, said this ends when Russia's out of Ukraine. On February 23rd, I bet you a lot of those people would have said, well, it ends when they're somewhere near the lines they already were occupying. Or maybe they can get a little more as long as this stops. Guess. That's a guess. But now they said they got to get out. So how do we get to the point where that becomes possible for the Russian regime? I think we're months away from knowing that. There's going to be a lot of pain along the way. So that's a deliberate non-answer, but I guess in that sense I agree with Tom Friedman. Well, I mean, always. I think that
possible that they could happen.
I think, I mean, the president said that no, we don't think he's going to use nuclear weapons. That is a line you don't get to come back from. And this is part of the tension, I think, when we look at what Russia wants from this, he felt he's launching a civilizational project, that he's the representative of a particular viewpoint in the world, and it needed to be made more powerful. Once he tries to do that on the backs of use of this horrible weapon, I mean, and we are the only country that's ever used it, but once he does that on the backs of that weapon, like you don't get to come back. And so he's got to sacrifice. There's sort of an image of Samson, right, in the temple, right, that at some point he's going to pull down the pillars around him, but he has to give up his own dream at the same time. And I think that's a really difficult thing for anyone to do. But we'll see.
Do you guys have any sensitivity for just how threatened Russia feels? A few years ago, we participated in the overthrow of the elected government in Kiev, and the U.S. clearly had a big role in that. We've moved NATO to the borders of Russia. It's almost all of Europe against Russia now. The Baltic states screamed from the tops of the trees to send U.S. military. What do you expect Russia to be doing at this point? And following up on this man's thing, they can't end it. We have to have some initiative for stopping this madness. Thank you.
Now, I guess, so I'm going to look at the question differently, and we may agree or disagree on this. But as Roy mentioned in my bio, so I did my little first tour. I spent a lot of 92 to 94 in Moscow and in Kyiv, as it turns out, and working on the transition from the Soviet Union to an independent Russia. The basic offer we made was, come be a normal country. Come be a participant in making the rules, including an offer to either join NATO or be in some kind of an arrangement where you can talk about security affairs. Come make the economic rules. And if you do that, your people will be more free and more prosperous. And now, as I get toward the end of my career, I'm working on the opposite. And that was really Russia's choice, because the end of an empire is never pretty. I spend a lot of time these days reading books about, histories of the end of each of the big European empires, including a really evocative book that's really a collection of notes called Forgotten Empires, about the sort of great, the Swedish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and all of these historical civilizations that once occupied huge swaths of Central and Eastern Europe, even Western Europe, if you go back as far as Charlemagne and his three grandkids. So it's not going to be pretty. Now, do I think Russia should be scared? Well, I really think the historical record needs to be clear. We offered guarantees to Russia that nothing offensive would be used against them. They could be a participant in any of the arrangements. And in fact, Putin himself, in 2002, said it was fine for the Baltics to join NATO. They raised no objection, particularly, to the Central Europeans joining NATO. So at that time, they didn't feel it was an existential threat. What made it an existential threat 15 years later? I think it was a man sitting in his room stewing, because what he realized when he looks at the globe, here's what the world looks like going forward. You have, I'm going to call it, because I'm a partisan here, the rule-abiding group of Western and Japan, East Asia, and our partners. That group of countries, it's about 1.5 billion people, 1.25 billion. And we're rich, we're used to making the rules. We have to make some room for other people to be a part of that. But we invited Russia into that group. It participated in some organizations, not in others. And it stopped. And then you have China, 1.5 billion people, getting richer, going to have a bumpy time right now, I think, but getting richer, intent on making its own rules. Now, what we see as our opportunities for cooperation and competition with China, right? The president's laid this out. Jake Sullivan just gave a great speech the other day. So we see this as a multifaceted, complicated relationship, not like the Cold War, but it's two huge groups of 1.5 billion people. Russia is 130 million people. And this is where I'm sympathetic to your point. It's 130 million people. Its neighbors are ambivalent to really angry at it. So it doesn't feel really good. And those aren't the neighbors that were in NATO. This is the Central Asians. These are the Caucasus who feel put upon, oppressed by sort of Russian intervention. So Russia looks around and says, well, we finally stabilized our population. Maybe it's close to 140 million. We have a bunch more cash, but we really haven't done anything to generate industry or creativity outside some very elite science sectors and commodities. What's our future in this world? And so, yes, they're upset about that. But the answer to that is not become a continental land power. I mean, that's Mein Kampf kind of logic, that we have to become a continental land power and claim a sphere of influence in which no one can influence us. That won't hold back the tide of commerce from these gigantic trading institutions on either side of you that are very attractive to your people. So it's not only an illegal remedy, it's the wrong remedy. So what are we offering? What we're going to offer again is a chance. Be a normal country. Come help make the rules, participate in this, and your people will be free and more prosperous. That's what will be on the table. Now, exactly how we go from the current situation to that, I think, there are historical analogs, and I know somebody will negotiate and talk about this, but you need a willing partner. And right now you have somebody who's so captivated by his own dream, I'm not sure he's a reliable partner. But you need to have a time when someone will listen to you. And at the end of the day, the offer is, come, be normal, be prosperous, be more free, or be authoritarian if you choose, but then you don't get to be part of our group. And that's what's on offer. But you don't get to take the dream away from others. And this is where I'd close. Because, and here, I'll try to channel some of Madeline's spirit in this. Because the flip side of saying that Russia's threatened, because now, whatever it is, 70, 80 million people in Central and Eastern Europe get to live as part of the EU and as part of NATO, that means those people have a chance that they were not given for a century. The Central Asians, I just met yesterday with a number of the sort of key population centers there, with the ministers representing them. They desperately want that chance. And they know they can't have it while a guy with an imperial vision feels free to impose that on his neighbors. So that's another 40-odd million people. So you're talking more than 100 million people who just want a chance to be normal, to be free and prosperous. And we're willing to offer them that chance. What does that mean for Russia? It means they should be the same, not superior. Now, does that threaten some people in Russia? I'm sure it does. But we see the same thing in our own population, right? Where some people are threatened by the availability of freedom and goods to people who don't look like them or people who have different traditions. Doesn't make it right and doesn't mean we have to stand by and listen to it. Yeah.
Let's go to some questions from Zoom. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much again for being here. Our first Zoom question is from Otis Burrow, who asks, is there such thing as max speed sanctions, meaning sanctions that seriously degrade military capability at the fastest pace possible?
Yes. And I think what you're seeing is we're learning how to run faster. So when I first ran sanctions programs or was an advisor on some in the 1990s, they were very cumbersome and not always based on very accurate research. We also did not think about using the tools, the export controls and other tools. I mean, they existed. There'd always been, like during the Cold War, trade restrictions and other items. But it was a very lengthy process to put things on the lists. And then given the way that global shipping moved so slowly, it would be months and years perhaps before they took effect. It was really in 2014 when Dan Fried had, in a predecessor position, and our European partners came together, we began to use these export controls in a more targeted way. But then they were more shaped at limiting Russia's economic potential because Putin had already seized Crimea and the battle in the east was largely kind of taking shape. So this is maybe the first time that we've really begun to identify specific items that go into specific parts of the Russian military sector, and we can take them away. And it's partly a function of our greater knowledge of supply chains, the transparency of some of the supply chains, and the speed with which they move, because it means that there aren't years of stockpiles sitting on shelves in Russian laboratories. It means what they do is order, and they show up 3 days later from Prague or from wherever. And now we're able to go and say, no, stop that. So it has a much greater effect. We do need to learn to be quicker. What we're seeing is Russia's learning how to create new tools and improvise in a way, and we're just getting that. So one of the discussions I had today was about specific techniques we're seeing them use. How quickly can we step in to do that? That takes learning and adapting our systems, and so we'll do it more and more. But as I said in the remarks, we are seeing this show up on the battlefield. So it's a great question, and it's a goal to try to be faster and faster.
So our second question from Zoom is from Thea Jones, and it's, how do you expect us to react to the very current news of Russia's threat to have no heat or water in Ukraine cities this winter?
I think we stop that from happening. That what Russia is attempting to do, first, there's a terrible, grotesque threat, not just to Ukraine, but to much of northwestern Europe, in that Russia keeps trying to cut off power to the largest nuclear plant in Europe. And that could be catastrophic. There's no military point to that, right? It's just punitive. If they are trying to take out the grid or the transportation network or other item, the heat in Ukraine, that's just an effort to punish the citizens so that they won't fight. Every Ukrainian I talk to says it will make them fight harder. So it's pointless. But I think what we need to do is work with the Ukrainians to protect some of the key items, protect hospitals, protect schools and population centers, protect key energy installations, so that they're able to have their population live while the soldiers are fighting. But it's obviously, it's a war crime, right? And you should read Roy's book to describe that. Yeah.
I'll bring it along next time so you can see it. It's still in print, in fact. So I have a question just following up on my own introduction to you, Jim, is if you look at the case of the late Mrs. Dugin, how did you actually come to designate a woman who's almost totally unknown to the American public as a propagandist? How did you get on the list, and how many other people are there like that?
I don't have the numbers, and I think she was designated before I got there. But I think I'll describe the sort of general situation. The people, as I mentioned, one of our goals here is to highlight the criminality of this imperial effort. So one part of that is to make sure that the world understands this is a colonial war, and that's very important when we're trying to build support in the global South. This isn't about Putin's claims of Nazis, which is. Just as a story about this, I was actually in Ukraine in 2014, and the U.S. didn't overthrow that government. The guy got scared and ran away. Like I'd spent hours with that guy. Like he's a guy who will run, and that's what happened, right? He fired on his own people, and then he realized it was going wrong, and he ran away. These were like a lot of brave Ukrainians standing around the presidential palace. In Kyiv, it sits on a hill, and there's a giant plateau below it. So it was literally, there were snipers on top of the presidential palace firing down into the crowd, and the crowd gradually began to move up the hill, kind of cobblestone by cobblestone. Incredible act of courage, because these were just ordinary citizens. They might at night go down, there's a McDonald's and a shopping mall, and they go down there to get a little bit warm, but come up and just creep up this hill. Against that, and at some point the guy cut and run.
My question is, with everything that you said about sanctions, obviously, the State Department, the Biden administration has done a very commendable job with it. But my question is on the reverse side, in terms of what the Putin regime is doing, in terms of the economic war that they're raging, because what we are seeing now, first of all, the invasion happened right as Angela Merkel left. And the invasion has also happened as, all sorts of things. At the time, we had no idea what the American economy was going to be like. But because of the crisis in the supply chain,
Yeah.
everything suddenly has gone to crap in terms of the economy everywhere. There's now a 100% forecast for recession. And it would be basically just in time for the 2024 election. Has this been factored in to the State Department's calculations?
As much as we can, right? I mean, not to be glib, right? But Yogi Berra was right when he didn't say, right? It's tough to predict, especially the future. For me, it's enough to say that the devastation every day as innocent civilians are targeted means we need to bring this war to a close. And we want to bring it to a close that Ukraine will accept and to a close that we think is sustainable. So if we rush to a peace that just allows Russia to rearm, we're going to be back at it in a couple of years. And I would not want to do that betting on 2025 and a particular political alignment. So I think we're doing it now because we got now. We have tools that will produce an awful lot of damage and I think create leverage to get a lasting peace now, over the next months and years. And that's part of my urgency about how we pursue this. So trying to get at that. Now, to do that, and I want to mention two elements, to do that at a time when there's incredible distress in the economic system does raise a lot of political challenges. So when I talk to my European counterparts, first, they deserve enormous credit because as much as we're feeling some pain, they're feeling much more. And yet they are standing strong, even when there are dramatic shifts in the political alignment of people, as in Italy or Sweden. They're standing very strong because they recognize the threat coming from this war. But they say we have to keep talking to our people about why this is worth it. Because if we don't, we're not going to be able to sustain it. And so I think engaging more is even more important. And I think that's also true. We look across the globe. Part of my mandate is to make sure that our sanctions don't cause pain to innocent people. And there's a whole discussion about this. Secretary Blinken announced a big initiative to allow for humanitarian activity in areas that are under sanction. We don't sanction food and fertilizer. I actually spend a fair bit of time every week working with Russian companies to be sure that their food and fertilizer is able to get out. I strongly support, I'm actively involved with the UN in their effort to get grain out and now fertilizer soon, I hope, out through Odessa to the global south. Because if we don't help people eat where they are or get access to the food or grow their own food over the next year or two, we'll see massive migration that will be incredibly unsettling. We'll see deaths because people don't have access to what they want. And I need to make sure that our sanctions are used in a way that doesn't make that worse, and if possible, try to make it a bit better. So when you ask is it calculated in, I think one, on the urgency, we want to get done as soon as we can, but also the political drivers of black swan events. Maybe they're not even black swans, right? Like if we allow fertilizer prices went up like 400 or 600%, that's often followed a couple years later by revolt and mass migration. So it's pretty predictable. We need to address that now. And so we're trying to do that at the same time. So I don't know if that gets at your question about the timescale, but please, yeah.
You want to stand up?
Was the invasion of Ukraine considered one of those black swan events, or was it something that Putin had a much more calibrated agenda that we haven't even figured out yet?
I don't want to try to get in his mind, because if you got stuck there, I imagine it's not pleasant. I don't think he's playing chess here. This is, remember, and you'll see this if you come to the Andrew session, and I keep pitching it, but this is a man whose core defining story is about the time he cornered a rat and the rat fought its way out. That's what he says. Whenever he feels himself pressed, he's like, this is what I learned. And so I don't think there's a sophisticated multi-phase game here. I think what he felt was he was looking at a world that for whatever reason seemed to be closed to the vision that, or closing to the vision he had, and so he lashed out. Now, was it foreseen? I wasn't in government, but I was preparing to, and many of my friends were. The smartest people on Russia were saying last October, we'll have a massive problem in Ukraine. Like this time he's up to something big. But what was interesting is we had a lot of trouble persuading others that he was going to invade. So many Europeans didn't believe it. And in fact, the Ukrainians didn't believe it. And as it turns out, I met with a bunch of prominent Russians. They didn't believe it. You know, when they were talking, even in some who were around circles of power 2 days before, they thought, oh, it's a feint, and, you know, he's going to go take a little more in the east. So this was really one guy who made a choice. And those who felt they understood him felt he was going to do it. But most of the rest of the world looked at it and said, this will be a disaster. He will never do it. But he did it.
One last question from our Zoom audience.
So our last question from Zoom is from Robbie Harris, and he asks, how do you explain the support of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, India, etc. for Putin's actions?
Yeah, I think it's a more... I think each of them is playing a different role. And so I wouldn't lump them together as a club at all. So Turkey has a, hundreds of year relationship with Russia, and is looking to play that historical role where sometimes it has the upper hand, sometimes it is a lower role. What's important to me, and from a pure sanctions standpoint, is that the private sectors in each of those countries are largely complying with the sanctions regime. And so even when we see the governments engage with Putin or talk to him in a way or do things we don't particularly like, the sanctions regimes are staying intact. But it's each one. India's never, I think, seen itself. India has this historical relationship with Russia, which is really more designed around its relation, its antagonism with China. And one of the opportunities in front of us now is for India to begin to reorient itself a little bit more to the West and not as dependent on Russia, because they can look at it and see, wow, Russia looks a lot weaker. Its military equipment doesn't look as good as in the sales brochures. Maybe we need to make a different set of choices. At the same time, we are encouraging Russian commodities to get to market. So India is buying an awful lot more Russian oil than it was before the war. And that's actually partly by design. Now Russia sells an enormous amount of its oil to China and India, a bit to Turkey. These are very tough negotiators, and the discounts that they're getting on Russian oil means Russia's making a lot less than it would if it would, again, just be a normal country. So I think in all of those, it's a much more subtle and nuanced situation, even when there are moments where we are public in disagreeing with the posture of the countries. It's not that they're on the other side and we're here. They're playing a much different role. And I'm just going to stop for a minute and praise Turkey. And I'm sorry, Roy, I know I'm going on and on. But I think there's been an exceptional development over the last months about exporting Ukrainian and Russian food. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia imposed an export ban on its own exports, and Ukraine wasn't able to export for a couple months. Normally, Ukraine exported 5 to 6 million tons of grain a month. That's enough food for tens of millions of people a month. And then we built up, and it was exporting just a bit, month on month, and we worked with the EU to open up routes through Poland and Hungary and especially Romania so that it could kind of get up to around 3 million tons a month. And that was vital food for a lot of people. But the UN brokered a deal with enormous help from Turkey to bring that grain out of Odessa. So now in September, Ukraine exported more than it used to average every month before. Russia, so since the end of July, Ukraine has exported 7.5 million tons from Odessa, which is below what it normally would, but you add up the other routes too, it's exporting a good 15 to 20 million tons of grain. Russia has exported probably 11 million tons of grain through the Black Sea in that period. So we're getting the food out to the people who desperately need it. And I'm just going to close it. This is a story, it was new to me. The history of that region was Ukraine always used to export through Poland and Romania and other places. And it was Catherine the Great who really created the city and the port of Odessa. And she reoriented all of these export routes through Russia, but especially Ukraine, to go out through the south, like a bathtub, like with one drain. And it all went through the Black Sea. So they became the dominant grain exporter to the world in the first part of the 19th century. And what happened? Well, what happened was Turkey decided to start closing the Bosphorus to regulate the flow of trade. So suddenly, Russia and Ukraine were no longer such a value, a reliable trading partner for the rest of the world. The beneficiary was where I grew up, the American Midwest, which because of the railways and the canals and everything, was then became the dominant exporter to the world. So you've seen Odessa and the Midwest go back and forth as the predominant grain suppliers to the world. And what's happening now? Putin shuts off the grain from Odessa. So that benefits Canada and Australia and to some extent the US, to the extent we want to export. And Ukraine now is exporting directly into the EU once again. So what's Putin done? He's given back the greatest accomplishment of Catherine the Great, which was a warm weather port. So he's not a genius playing like multiple roles down the line. He's giving up one of Russia's great imperial projects. And that was a project that was rooted in the relationship with Turkey. And now it's the relationship with Turkey that's determining how much of that project still survives. So with that little historical nugget, I'll turn it over to Roy.
Well, all I can say is I can see why you go from one high position to another, and I can see why they value you so highly, and so do we. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.